It's about that time for mock drafts. Welcome into Fantasy Baseball today on Thursday, January 16th. I am Frank Stampfl, joined by Scott White. Today on the show, we are recapping a 12-team Roto mock draft that we did just on Tuesday night when you were listening to this. We will break down the best and worst picks from each of the first 10 rounds of that one. And towards the end of the podcast, if we have time, always got to throw that disclaimer in there. Scott and I will take a look at our teams and we'll talk about what we did, whether or not it worked. It didn't work. Scott had the first overall pick. I had the second pick. And Chris was drafting third. Did you do that on purpose, Scott? We would all be drafting.
Oh, I didn't set up this draft. Chris set it up. So you'll have to ask him.
Oh,
I have to think it was on purpose, but I don't remember getting an email showing the draft order. Do you remember getting that email?
No, it might have just been the same draft order from last year.
Yeah, I may have just defaulted to the order we joined the league.
Okay.
But whatever.
We were drafting back to back, and so that was that made for some fun time. So we'll recap our teams towards the end. And again, this was a 12-team Roto mock draft. This was our first draft here in 2025. It was our third mock draft of the offseason. So we did another one back in December. I think we did one back in October, but this is the latest one. And don't worry, regardless of what format you play in, more mock drafts are coming. Those results will all be live on the website. But this one that we're talking about today is 12-team Roto. We'll have head-to-head points coming up. We'll have head-to-head categories. And once we get into March, I think we'll be doing a live mock draft like every week. So either Tuesday or Wednesday nights. So don't worry if we haven't covered the format that you play in. I'm sure that we will do that at some point here. If you're looking for the results of this mock draft, they will be in the FPT newsletter, which will come out on Friday. So make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. That's cbssports.com/newsletters. Once you're logged in, you just click on the FPT logo and it automatically signs you up for the newsletter. I will pull up the draft results here, Scott, for those watching on YouTube so they can get a little taste of what's going on here. And here we go. We'll just go round by round, talk about some of the best and worst picks. And I will read off the picks as we go along here. So the first 6 picks of this draft were Shohei Ohtani, Bobby Witt, Aaron Judge. Again, those top 3 to you, me, and Chris in that order, followed by Juan Soto, Julio Rodriguez, and Elly De La Cruz. That was the top 6. And then the back half of the first round, Jose Ramirez, Kyle Tucker, Mookie Betts, Fernando Tatis, Gunnar Henderson, and Francisco Lindor. Scott, kick us off. The best pick of the first round.
The best pick of the first round is, it's hard to find value in round 1. So that's a little more difficult to say than it'll probably be in most other rounds. But I'm going to go with Jose Ramirez at 7, just because I rank Jose Ramirez 5th. 1, 2, 3, 4 were almost exactly the order I ranked them in: Ohtani, Witt, Judge, Soto. I think I have Judge ahead of Witt, but those are my top 4. Soto at 4. I don't think we'll see it often, but that is who I think belongs there. Jose Ramirez, though, would come right after them, being that he fills one of the weaker positions and is just a constant in round 1, providing power and speed.
I'm not going to argue with you about Jose Ramirez. For me, the one that stood out was Gunnar Henderson, actually, 11th overall. I have him, it looks like 6th in my Roto rankings. So, yeah, getting 5 picks of value. And it's hard to really nitpick any pick in the first round. These are all obviously great elite players. But, yeah, for me, I think Gunnar Henderson should probably go somewhere in the top half of the first round. So to get him all the way down at 11, I thought that was tremendous value there. So anyone else drafting, and regardless of format, I know we're talking about Roto today, but I think Gunnar should be a top 6 pick in both head-to-head points and in Roto leagues. What about the worst pick of the first round, Scott? Which one has you scratching your head a little bit?
I would say the most questionable one is Julio Rodriguez, which, it's not like it's a terrible pick. He was the consensus number 3 player in this format last year. 2 or 3 was between him and Bobby Witt, who went after Ronald Acuna. And obviously still plenty young. He's still pre-prime, I would say, just from an age perspective. And so for him to deliver on that potential we all thought he had just a year ago would not at all be shocking. But from a from the standpoint of how confident can I be that this pick is going to live up what I invested in him, it's a little off because he's now, for all 3 years of his career, he's gotten off to dreadful starts. And while the first 2 years he was able to finish strong enough to redeem it more or less, we've been pricing in, prior to this year, we had been pricing in that the slow starts were a fluke and that Julio Rodriguez could be who he's been to close out the season over a full season, you know? And I'm losing confidence that's actually the case. And worse, things could play out like they did last year, where if he gets off to that dreadful start and then at some point thereafter Julio Rodriguez suffers an injury of some kind, he doesn't have as much time to redeem that slow start. And that's basically what happened to him last year. It doesn't mean it'll happen again. Like I said, this pick could be totally fine, but I think I'm to a point with Julio Rodriguez where I'm pricing in a little more downside than I had in previous years.
Yep, absolutely in agreement here. Julio Rodriguez went 5th overall in this draft, was a top 3 pick in drafts last season, but he let us down. So I think we do have to drop him a little bit behind some of the players that are just more proven, guys that have done it more consistently. You mentioned Jose Ramirez. I think absolutely should go ahead of Julio Rodriguez. Kyle Tucker has done it for a few years now at an elite level. And, you know, frankly, without that shin injury, we might be talking about him as like a top 3 player in fantasy baseball. So I would put Julio at least behind those guys. If you look at our overall rankings on the site, Scott, you have Julio 13th and Chris and I both have him 12th overall. So more of a 1-2 turn kind of player is Julio Rodriguez this season. Let's move into the second round of this Roto mock draft we just did. And taking a look at it, starting at pick 13, we saw Jackson Chourio, followed by Corbin Carroll, Ronald Acuna, Yordan Alvarez, Vladimir Guerrero Jr., and Jarren Duran. And then the back half, Bryce Harper, Trey Turner, Freddie Freeman, Tarek Skubal, Paul Skeens, and Ketel Marte. For anybody listening out there, a pretty popular theme, I would say, for the first 10 rounds of this draft was that everybody waited on pitching. And that has been pretty consistent with all of the mock drafts that we've done this offseason. We don't necessarily see that reflected in ADP. I don't know if it's because, you know, we've kind of talked about our strategy, Scott, and waiting a little bit. And so we're, you know, doing mock drafts with other people that I would assume listen to this podcast, whatever it might be. But people waited on pitching. And so, look, we don't see the SP1 and the SP2 go until picks 22 and 23 in this draft. So
everybody waited on pitching except you and Chris.
Yeah, because at that point, I looked at my overall rankings, and that's who was next up. I mean, to me, there's a pretty clear, I think, drop-off in the elite hitter pool. Maybe that's not fair to the Ketel Martes and Devers and Austin Rileys of the world, but it just kind of feels that way in my mind that once you get past Trey Turner and Freddie Freeman, those pitchers should probably be gone. And so those are the next players I had up, and so we took those guys. But who did you think was the best pick here in round 2?
Well, just to follow up on your point real quick, so Chris took Skubal, you took Skeens. That left Zach Wheeler there, who I actually rank ahead of Skeens. And that was my highest ranked player when my pick came up there at the end of round 2. So I almost followed suit.
You're a fraud, Scott.
I almost followed suit and took Wheeler right after you took Skubal and Skeens. But I was like, this is not how I really want to build a team this year. I've talked before about how the first 4 or maybe even 5 rounds I want to take hitters because I like that good glob, that 15 to 50 range at starting pitcher so much. And I feel like the hitter talent drops off at that same point. So that's really where I want to load up on pitching. And so since it's still early in mock draft season, I didn't want to divert from the plan too much. I wanted to test and see if I was satisfied with the way it turned out. So I agree that there is a little bit of a drop off there after the Bryce Harper and Trey Turners of the world, when you then get into the Ketel Martes. But I went ahead and took Ketel Marte, and we'll get into how I feel like it turned out, me doing that.
Look, for what it's worth, a little spoiler alert for later, I think your pitching staff turned out great. So
yeah,
it might have.
I agree.
It seems like it worked out. But what did you think the best pick was?
Okay, so the best pick here in round 2, I know what the worst pick was, but the best pick there's actually a few candidates for worst pick. I'm going to say it's Corbin Carroll. I'd be okay with saying it's Tarek Skubal, who I actually ranked 17th and he went 22nd, but I rank Corbin Carroll 10th and he went 14th. So that one spot advantage that Skubal had, it being later in the draft, same round, I understand, but that's kind of the difference between how much value you can get in the 10 to 14 range versus the 17 to 22 range. That if you follow what I'm saying there, that's how much more valuable it's worth. Like the extra one spot discount later round 2 isn't as worth it to me as getting Carroll 4 picks later than I rank him. Carroll should be an elite base stealer. He got off to a miserable start first 2 months, but for the final 4, he was top 5 overall player, I believe it was, something like that. And I think he put to rest with his performance in those final 4 months any concerns about his shoulder and impact it will have on his power production. And I think, he's going to be a run scoring monster. I think he's basically a first round caliber player here. I'd be happy to take him with the second pick of round 2.
Yeah. The best pick for me is going to be Tarek Skubal. Again, you kind of talked about it, but to be able to get the SP1 all the way down at pick 22, I rank him 16th overall. I think once you get past Carroll and Yordan Alvarez there at the end of the first, early second, Vlad Jr., Lindor, those names, then I would be okay actually taking Skubal as high as that. I mentioned, Chris took Skubal, I took Skeens after that drop off at hitter, but I wouldn't surprise me if they actually go a little bit higher in drafts. I actually think in NFBC ADP, those guys are actually first round picks, both Skubal and Skeens. So lasting a little bit further here, I thought Skubal, I thought both were great picks, but Skubal is my SP1, so I will mark that as the best pick here. You said there were a couple options, Scott, for the worst pick of round 2. Who is your number 1 worst pick?
Tough to narrow down, actually. So I don't like Jackson Chourio here as the first pick of round 2, and I don't like Ronald Acuna as the third pick of round 2. I think there could come a point where I do like Ronald Acuna 15th overall. It'll depend on how things play out for him in spring training, if he's able to appear in a game, if the Braves offer a clearer timetable for when he's going to return from a torn ACL. When I first put together my rankings in October and we hadn't heard any word of him potentially being delayed for the start of the season, I was ranking Ronald Acuna 4th. So I'm willing to take on a certain amount of performance risk as he comes back from this torn ACL. It's just the playing time loss that's harder to justify, and I'm not ready to justify it at 15th overall at this point. But because that could change, I'm going to say Chourio at 13th is my least favorite pick here. So I'm kind of giving you a double dip, if you don't mind. I think Chourio could absolutely live up to this. It's just an unnecessary gamble this early in the draft. I have him as like a borderline second, third rounder. And so after that little dip in the hitter pool that we were talking about earlier, that's when I think it's appropriate to take Chourio, hoping that he maximizes his power speed outcomes. Obviously, he showed he has 2020 potential last year. From June on, he was a really high-end player. But you're talking about early round mainstays, guys that we expect to be drafted in round 1 most years, like Corbin Carroll, like Yordan Alvarez, going behind Jackson Chourio. And I have a hard time justifying that.
Yep, those are the exact 2 names that I wrote down here as well. Carroll, Yordan Alvarez, Vlad Jr. I think all 3 of those should go ahead of Jackson Chourio. I understand if you want to get the speed. We have explained why we don't think it's as necessary to get speed early on. You can find it in the middle to later rounds, I think easier than years past. I think it's more important to load up on some of that power. So whether it's Alvarez or Vlad Jr., who can hit 285, 290 plus with 30 home runs, I would prefer to get a player like that over a Jackson Chourio, but he absolutely could live up to that price tag. Before we take our first break, just a reminder to download and follow FBT Express wherever you listen to podcasts. It's 8 to 10 minutes. We talk about either the biggest news of the day or, we take some snippets from this full-length podcast and we just kind of break it down and condense it into a 10-minute podcast. So wherever you listen to podcasts, make sure to follow that. And we usually actually go live with that podcast right after we finish this one. So, 15 minutes after, something like that. So if you stick around all the way through this and you want to watch a little bit more live content, then feel free to watch FBT Express live here on the channel. Let's take our first break. When we return, we'll jump into round 3. We'll do that right after this.
Stay tuned at halftime of the AFC Divisional Playoff game for a sneak peek of 1923 Season 2, streaming February 23rd, exclusively on Paramount+.
Welcome back in Fantasy Baseball. Today, we're breaking down our latest 12-team Roto mock draft, and we are jumping into round 3, where the top picks were Rafael Devers, then Austin Riley, Zach Wheeler, Wyatt Langford, Ozzie Albies, and Jazz Chisholm. Then the second half of round 3 was William Contreras, Jackson Merrill, Logan Gilbert, Matt Olson, Corbin Burns, and Manny Machado. Scott, taking a look here. The best pick in round 3 was blank.
Well, again, from a pure value standpoint, I feel like I should say Zach Wheeler. But if I passed up Zach Wheeler at a value, then I passed him up twice at a value, basically. I passed him up twice at a value, taking Ketel Marte and Rafael Devers at the 2-3 turn. So I clearly didn't like the idea of taking Wheeler there, even though my rankings said I should. So I'm going to pass up that one and say Jackson Merrill. Jackson Merrill as the, let's see, what is that? That is the 32nd overall pick.
Yep.
And I rank him 26th. And I have him one spot behind Jackson Chourio, actually. So I have them 25th and 26th in my overall rankings, when in this draft they went 13th and 32nd. Much rather would have Merrill at that relative cost. I think they have similar. I think they profile similarly in terms of like overall output. Chourio's a safer bet for steals, but Merrill's not like a 0 for steals. Meanwhile, Merrill, I think, is a safer bet for batting average. Power production should be similar. I think they're more or less the same. And I actually have a slight bit more trust in Merrill. Like, I don't think either is a bust waiting to happen, but I think Merrill's bust potential is slightly less than Chourio's.
Yeah, that was actually the name I wrote down here as well. Scott's kind of stealing from my cheat sheet, I've noticed a little bit. Jackson Merrill, I thought, was the best pick. Again, he went 19 picks after Jackson Chourio. I agree. I think it's a similar skill set. I think there maybe is a little bit more upside with Chourio, definitely in terms of steals. But the batting average, I actually would expect, I think, to be a little bit higher for someone like Jackson Merrill. He makes a lot of contact. He hits the ball hard. Does have to improve against left-handed pitching, but when you consider he did all of that as a 21-year-old and while learning a new position too, like on all of that combined, the fact that Jackson Merrill just did, and he was a great defender, just a truly, truly magical season from Jackson Merrill. And I expect him to build off of that here in year 2 as well. What about the worst pick in round 3, Scott? We might have the same answer for this one too.
Just real quick on Jackson Merrill, from June on, we focused a lot on what Chourio did during that time. But from June on, Merrill hit 299 with 21 homers, 9 steals, and a 901 OPS. So he surged at the same point Chourio did, to less fanfare, I would say. Okay, yeah, the worst pick in round 3, I think, is pretty obvious. It's Wyatt Langford as the 4th pick of round 3. Again, it's not unthinkable that Wyatt Langford could deliver a 3rd-round outcome. You take what he did last September, it looked like he was finally living up to the potential we all thought he had, what made him such a trendy pick in drafts last year. And, power, speed, he could deliver all that and maybe end up performing on the level of like Jackson Merrill and Jackson Chourio this year. But nobody's taking him around 3. It's as simple as that. Like, why, when you have Jackson Merrill there, still on the board as he was, he didn't go for until 4 picks after Langford went. Why would you take Langford instead when potentially you could have both? Given what Langford's ADP is. So you're not drafting in like a echo chamber or something. You know what the perception, what the expectation is for Langford. Even if you have a different expectation, there's no need to go this far ahead of what the consensus is. You can ensure you get Langford without doing that. What is Langford's ADP?
So in January over at the NFBC, it is 46.8.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, even that, you're not guaranteed he'll be there.
You're not guaranteed to get him late in 4, but that's about what the ADP is.
Yeah. And for most of the offseason, it's been in the 50s. And I rank Wyatt Langford at 53. I actually wrote him up in Breakouts 1.0. If you look at what he did from June on last year, a lot of that was backloaded by a big September. But his pace, full season pace from June on was like 23 homers, 28 steals with a good batting average. And I think the power was probably the most projectable tool of all for Wyatt Langford. So wouldn't surprise me one bit if he goes 25 this upcoming season. But again, you don't have to draft him like he's already done that. You can think, even if you wait till the 4th round, you're pretty likely to get Wyatt Langford there. So that was the worst pick for me here.
As the September numbers I was trying to reference for Wyatt Langford, in that 1 month, he hit 300 with 8 homers, 7 steals, a 996 OPS. And his BABIP was only 324. It wasn't outrageous during that month. So, you can understand the enthusiasm for Langford, but it's just, I don't know. This doesn't. It's a reach to take him this early, a reach of at least a full round, I would say.
Yeah, that's why listed here as well as the worst pick of round 3. I did want to give an honorable mention to Jazz Chisholm, which breaks my heart because I love the player and I loved when the Yankees traded for him. I actually have his Marlins jersey. I like the player. There's no doubt. It's just, he feels very boom or bust-y for a 3rd round pick. I don't mind taking players who have big upside, swing for the fences, more so in the middle to late rounds. I don't really want to do that with my 3rd pick. I understand Jazz Chisholm's upside is massive. We saw some of that with the Yankees, but he has an extensive injury history. So I think there's a pretty low floor here for Jazz, and I would not be drafting him in the 3rd round personally. Maybe he's going to be in Bust 1.0. I still have to iron that out, but we'll see. Let's move on to the 4th round here and taking a look at the picks. We had Jose Altuve go 37th overall, followed by Pete Alonso, O'Neal Cruz, Emmanuel Clase, Garrett Crochet, and Corey Seager. And then Chris Sale, CJ Abrams, Cole Reagans, Marcus Semien, Michael Harris, and Dylan Cease, who went to you, Scott. So what did you think was the best pick here in round 4?
The best pick in round 4.
This felt like a very appropriate round. I don't know if you feel differently. This round felt like, to me, there were no crazy outliers. I thought it was just a pretty good round all around.
Yeah, I would say so. I have Altuve as my 35th ranked player, and he went 37th overall here as the first pick of round 4. So that's pretty much right in line. We're talking best pick, right?
Yes.
I guess this is one of those times where I'm going to choose my own pick. That's okay.
Boo!
Haven't done it yet. But I think Dylan Cease here as the 48th overall pick, last pick of round 4.
It's a good pick.
I have him 42nd overall, and I don't think I have pitchers ranked as high as most people do, just in general. So ideally, I'd wait another round or 2 to take a pitcher, but there came a point here where the value was just too good to ignore, and Dylan Cease. Look, my top 2 hitters on the board were Kyle Schwarber and Marcell Ozuna at that point, both DH only, and there's no bench in this league. I had already taken Shohei Ohtani in round 1, so that they just weren't an option for me.
Yep.
And I thought the remaining hitters were another step back from who had been taken at this point. So I like Cease 48th overall.
But Scott, you could have taken them. You could have moved Ohtani into a pitcher spot.
I could have. But that's not how I plan to use Ohtani in 2025. And I don't think I'm alone in that regard.
Yep, fair enough. I did like the Dylan Cease pick. I have him 44th overall in my rankings. The name that I chose here, and again, I felt everything was pretty fine. Like, I didn't think there was any crazy values here, but Corey Seager, 42nd overall. I know he just had another sports hernia surgery, his second one of 2024. He had 2 sports hernia surgeries in 1 year, and typically he does miss time. He's dealt with a lot of injuries in his career as well. But when he's on, I mean, he performs like a second round hitter. So when he's on, he's kind of in that Yordan, Alvarez, Vlad Jr. 4 category stud kind of mold. So if he's healthy in spring, maybe there's a chance this ADP actually rises up a little bit. But I think for now, 4th round is okay on Corey Seager. So I did like
where do you have him ranked?
I have Corey Seager at 38th overall.
38th. Because I'm looking now and I actually have him 30th. So I should have said Corey Seager. And in fact, I remember now as the draft was playing out, it's coming up to me late in round 12. I'm seeing Seager's out there, and I am hoping he comes to me at the end of round 4. He didn't. He went 6 picks too early, it looks like. But that was what was happening in my head as the picks were playing out.
All right. What about the worst pick in round 4? This one was kind of tough. Again, I didn't really think anything was that far off here in round 4.
Yeah, I agree. They're all pretty good. I could say Emmanuel Clase just because any closer would be too early in round 4. I understand it happening sometimes in those 15-team Roto leagues. So in FBC, if we're also oriented toward NFBC ADP, that it kind of causes us to inflate the value of closers. But certainly in a 12-team league, there's not the same scarcity in the saves category, and there's just no reason to go for a closer this early. So that's kind of the easy response. I don't really like O'Neal Cruz, though, at 39th overall.
Yep, that's my pick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can talk more about it, Frank.
Yeah, look, he's going higher than he was last year when his ADP was in the 50s, and he was okay. He had a fine season. He went 2020. I think we're still waiting for that big breakout. And I think O'Neal Cruz has that potential. We just haven't seen it yet. And he's another player where I think the floor is a little bit lower than people might want to admit. The strikeouts are still a major issue for O'Neal Cruz, and he's bad against lefties, flat out bad. I mean, I think it's something like a 40% strikeout rate in his career against left-handed pitching. So he's not going to sit against lefties, but I think playing against them is actually going to drag O'Neal Cruz's numbers down. So look, 6 months from now, I could be sitting here and O'Neal Cruz is, on his way to like a 30-30 season. I recognize that upside, but I do think there are still pretty big flaws in O'Neal Cruz's game. So I would not be using an early 4th round pick on him.
Yeah, I don't think we've seen O'Neal Cruz's final form, but the lack of progress from year to year, I understand he missed almost all of 2023 with injuries. So how much progress do we expect to make? Do we expect him to make from his debut until 2024? But it's basically been none. And he is now 26 years old. So it feels less like an inevitability, that he's going to transform into this first round fantasy monster than it did when he first debuted at 22. But it could still happen.
Scott, were you a Dragon Ball Z fan growing up?
No.
Okay, because when you say final form, it just makes me think of Frieza from Dragon Ball Z. Like, this isn't even my final form. It's just it's a pretty popular quote there in Dragon Ball Z history. So
I mean, like, I played enough Final Fantasy games. I feel like that was something that was always happening in those kinds of games. The enemy, the boss, you'd fight him like 6 times in the game, but he had yet to achieve his final form. So yeah, no, same for O'Neal Cruz. I understand the reference in a broad sense, just not in the narrow Dragon Ball Z sense. Yeah.
On the spot, Scott, give me your top Final Fantasy all time. It's a loaded question.
It is. Because I could go 4 different ways with that, I think. 5 different ways with it. I'm going to say, you didn't want me to spend this much time thinking it over. I'm going to say 5 just because it never gets any love.
Okay.
And it introduced the job system. You could really customize your characters with all different kinds of skills. And it was a blast. That's a good one. But I like 8 also. I like 7 also. I like 4. I like 6, but not as much as everybody else seems to.
I've played parts of a lot of them, but I'm such a fraud, Scott. I never beat a single Final Fantasy. It's just, and you go back now, it's a little bit tougher because the graphics are bad, if we're just being honest, relatively to what's out now. And they're long. They're really long games, so it takes a lot of time to beat them. But I've played 7, I've played 8, I've played 10, 10-2. I don't know if I played any of the other ones, but yeah, those were all awesome. So one day I'll have to go back and beat those. Let's get into round 5 of this mock draft, and starting with James Wood at pick 49, followed by Marcell Ozuna, Brent Rooker, Michael King, Yoshinobu Yamamoto, and Teoscar Hernandez. And then Blake Snell, Josh Hader, Kyle Schwarber, Jacob deGrom, George Kirby, and Garrett Cole. So who was the best pick here in round 5?
The best pick in round 5 was James Wood because I made it. Now I'm going to go with your pick, Frank.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to go with your pick, Marcell Ozuna. And it's good because that's about where I rank him. It's a little, what number pick are we on here? Early in round 5.
Would have been 50th overall, I believe.
Yeah, so I got him 45th. So it's a good value relative to where I have him. I trust, after back-to-back Studley seasons, I trust him to deliver on it. And I was relieved to see it as part of the thinking here, because as I mentioned earlier, I drafted Shohei Ohtani with the first overall pick. He is my number 1 overall player, but I'm not totally sold on it, both because he's coming back from a shoulder injury that he suffered on a slide when he was stealing a base. So is he going to be, is that going to affect his power, the recovery? Is it going to affect his willingness to run, et cetera, et cetera? Some concerns introduced, and he's DH only. So he occupies that spot from the get-go when there are 4 other high caliber, or is it 3 other? Yeah, 3 other high caliber DH only players: Marcell Ozuna, Brent Rooker, Kyle Schwarber. Fortunately, they all went here in round 5, which I think is more or less spot on. But sometimes we see those guys, because you can only stick them in that DH spot, we see them slide to round 7, 8, even beyond. And if that had happened in this draft, might have been kicking myself for taking Ohtani over Witt or Judge.
Yeah. If you look at the ADP for the NFBC in January, Ozuna is at 67, Kyle Schwarber at 69, and Brent Rooker at 71. So typically in the drafts that we have seen done so far, they do last a little bit longer than this. But as Chris and I have talked about all offseason, other mock drafts that we've done, just anytime I can get one of those guys in around pick 50 or after pick 50, I think I'm going to do it every time. It might be what my draft strategy is built around most as of now. And there's still time this offseason to research players and learn more and figure out what that strategy is. But kind of the early feel is anytime I can get one of those names in round 5, I'm going to do that. So that's what I did here with Marcell Ozuna, who I do rank the highest of the 3 with Ozuna, Brent Rooker, and Kyle Schwarber.
You know what I'm seeing now? I actually have Schwarber slightly ahead of Ozuna, and Schwarber went the latest of the 3. So I'm taking it back, Frank. Wasn't your pick that was the best. It was Jake Holland taking Kyle Schwarber with the 9th pick in round 5.
Yeah, I did highlight that one. I thought that was a good pick. Just the fact that, to me, I think all 3 of those names should go close to each other, and Schwarber went the latest. So it felt like the best value, and so I did like that pick. I did want to highlight George Kirby as well. Not a huge target for me, I don't think, this offseason, but I have him ranked 48th, so should go towards the end of the 4th round. And he went with pick 59 here, so the second to last pick of round 5. And I mentioned that pitching just kind of lasted a little bit longer in this draft. And to me, Scott, that's just good value. I think George Kirby is a borderline SP1. He's like a high-end SP2. You probably want to pair him with someone who's going to get a lot of strikeouts, but I do like that at the end of round 5 for George Kirby.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
What about the worst pick, Scott? What did you not like in round 5?
Well, I obviously don't like Josh Hader, but I'm not going to give the same spiel I did for Emmanuel Clase. And I don't even think it's the pick I like the least. The pick I like the least is Jacob deGrom. It is absolutely crazy to me that he is drafted as early as he is. And he didn't even go as early in this draft as he goes in the typical NFBC draft. In this one, let's see, he went 58th overall.
Yep. And the ADP in January is 46.
Yeah. I mean, I get that he's one of he's arguably the most dominant pitcher of his generation, I guess, if we're putting him behind, if we're putting him in a separate generation from like Kershaw and Verlander and Scherzer, or even if we're not, just inning for inning, deGrom has done remarkable things, but he is going to turn 36 this season, and he's fresh off of Tommy John surgery, got 10 innings last year.
His second Tommy John surgery.
His second Tommy. Oh, I forgot about that. Second Tommy John surgery for deGrom. Wow. Yeah, that even, gosh. As much as we've hammered that home for Shane McClanahan, that's definitely worth bringing up. So he's 36 this year. He's coming back from his second Tommy John surgery. He got only 10 innings last year. Pitched reasonably well. The velocity was down a little. But the age, the extent of the injury, the fact that he hasn't really proven himself coming back from this. And the biggest reason of all, even if you assume best case scenario for deGrom coming back from this injury, he picks up right where he left off. Well, what was he doing right when he left off? He was maxing out at like 90 innings a year for 21, 22, 23, like 4 straight years. He hadn't thrown 100 innings in a season since 2019. And while injuries happen, the nature of deGrom's injuries was especially concerning because they were all usage-related injuries. They were having to do with his throwing elbow, his throwing forearm, his throwing shoulder. Multiple instances of this every year. It just seemed to me that his body was not able to hold up to the kind of velocity he was generating. And it's worth pointing out that this rash of injuries started when he began throwing the ball harder. So he started throwing the ball harder than his body could hold up to, is what it seemed like to me. And now that he's in his late 30s, I don't think that's going to change. The possible silver lining is that, like I mentioned, he wasn't throwing as hard coming back from Tommy John surgery. Okay, normally we consider that a bad thing. Could it be a good thing in deGrom's case because his body holds up better? I guess you could make that argument, but that seems like a crazy train of thought to follow in round 4. I have him going more like round 9. I'm sorry, this is round 5 is where he actually went here, but I have him going more in like round 9.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have him as my SP19. He was the 13th starting pitcher off the board here in this draft, and that was my pick as well. It's not one that I would make in round 5. Let's take our final break. When we return, we'll jump into round 6 of this mock draft. We'll do that right after this. Welcome back in Fantasy Baseball. Today we are recapping our latest mock draft, and we are jumping into round 6 here. Sorry, I just had like a cough attack during that commercial break, and so that's why I kind of sound weird. I'm trying to like regain composure. But here we are, round 6 of this mock draft, which started with Pablo Lopez, followed by Adley Rutschman, Tyler Glasnow, Devin Williams, Yainer Diaz, and Framber Valdez. And then the back half of round 6, Luis Robert, Zach Gallen, Mark Vientos, Lawrence Butler, Shota Imanaga, and Willie Adames. Scott, best pick here in round 6.
The best pick in round 6. I'm going to give it to one of the pitchers, I think, which I'm trying to avoid doing too much because pitchers as a whole went later here. But I'm going to say it's Framber Valdez, though Shota Imanaga is a good pick as well. I'm going to say it's Valdez in part because he is part of that top 14 that I do think distinguishes itself from 15 through 50, that number I keep referring to. Imanaga's 15, so he's right on the borderline. They're both right on the borderline, I guess, but I have Valdez as being a little more projectable, a little more, he's going to give you the big volume that he always does. So I have him as he's in a tier above Imanaga, but Imanaga's at the top of the very next tier, and if he obviously just follows through on what he did last year, it's a great pick. And you could argue he's even better than Valdez, but I do have concerns with his fly ball rate and the potential for home runs inflating his ERA. Didn't catch up to him last year, but it still could for Imanaga.
Yeah, I love that call because I was the one who drafted Shota Imanaga. So yes, that was a great pick, Scott. I do agree on Framber Valdez. That was actually who I had written down here. He went 66th overall. He was the 17th starting pitcher off the board. I rank Valdez as my SP12 heading into this season. And I'm buying what he did last year when he increased that curveball usage over his final 14 starts, a 2.08 ERA, 0.96 whip, 10 K per 9 for Framber Valdez. I don't think he's necessarily going to do that again, but I think he could deliver low-end SP1 numbers. And he's also entering a contract year. So I do kind of factor that in here for Framber Valdez, who's a workhorse. He's, consistently gives us lots of innings as well. What about the worst pick in round 6, Scott? Who'd you have here?
The worst pick in round 6. I'm going to say it's Zach Gallen. I think. I don't love the Zach Gallen pick. I don't love the Mark Vientos pick. I don't love the Pablo Lopez pick, frankly. But I think the worst of them is Gallen, who I rank outside my top 30 at starting pitcher. And as I've already mentioned, we're more like the 15 range of the starting pitcher rankings, or at least my starting pitcher rankings.
Yeah, he was the SP 18 in this draft. I have him 35th, so I wholeheartedly agree.
And we're kind of used to drafting him in this range, so it may turn out fine. I lost a lot of trust in him last year because it was a struggle, especially coming back from a hamstring injury in the second half. Everything just seemed off. His swinging strike rate was terrible. His walk rate was strangely high. And he's somebody who has elbow ligament damage, a sprain in his past. And I just wonder, anytime I see these kind of inexplicable characteristics from a pitcher that just make him seem not like himself, that makes me wonder if something worse is on the horizon. That is the doomsday scenario for Zach Gallen. But ultimately, I don't trust him to deliver a good ERA, even if he's totally fine. Final 16 starts last season after returning from the hamstring injury, a 4.27 ERA and a 1.41 whip.
Yeah, that's who I flagged here as well. I agree on Zach Gallen. The whip being high, the walk rate being up, and consistently gives up hard contact the past couple of years. Now, we're poo-pooing that as as a top 20 starting pitcher drafted. If he goes outside of the top 30 starting pitchers, closer to his ADP, which is outside the top 100 overall picks, then I do think maybe there could be even some value there, Scott. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if, Gallen being drafted as an SP3 could return, back to like SP2 form. But the thing here is that you don't have to draft him there to find out. You could typically wait until after round 10 or whatever it might be to take on a Zach Gallen. So don't have to draft him as an SP2, but maybe you wind up getting SP2 numbers from him.
It's also easier to view him in a negative light given the depth at starting pitcher this year, the number of high quality options that there are. He just doesn't stand out as much as we've seen in the past.
I did have to bring up one pick, Scott, because you drafted Willy Adames, and he's on your bust list. How could you do this?
Yeah. Well,
it looked like you thought about it because you took 44 seconds to make that pick. So.
Yeah, I was trying to talk myself out of it. So this was the 72nd pick in the draft, which is actually a little lower than I rank him. But I do think there is the potential for him to perform well below that. I didn't, since we're just now entering, you just took Imanaga, who I said as the start of the good glob at starting pitcher. So I didn't want to go starting pitcher because we're still at the start of it. And I didn't have a shortstop yet. And I needed some steals, which, Adames did that for the first time last year, but he did do it. He contributed 20 plus steals. I thought, okay, maybe I could hold out for Bo Bichette, who I think is one of the most undervalued players in drafts this year. But hey, Bo Bichette, did he not make it back to me? Yeah, he didn't make it back to me. So I wouldn't have had a chance at him anyway. So I was hesitant to take Adames there, but I think it worked out since Bichette wasn't available.
All right, let's move into round 7, where we saw Christian Yelich, the first pick of that round, followed by Jordan Westburg, Edwin Diaz, Christian Walker, Luis Castillo, Matt McClain, and then Josh Naylor, Mason Miller, Royce Lewis, Junior Caminero. Let's see, do I have this loaded up? Up. Yes, I do.
Caminero! Ha, Caminero!
And then after Caminero, we got Anthony Santander and Ryan Helsley. So, Scott, best pick of round 7. Are you obligated to say Junior Caminero?
I'm not.
Because you made that song.
I know, and I made that song and totally inflated his value. He's now priced out of my range for him, it seems like. So, no, I'm not going to call him the best pick here in round 7. I don't know that I love the value of anyone taken in round 7. I guess it would be one of the first basemen, Christian Yelich or Josh Naylor. Or I could just pick my own guy, Christian Yelich, at the start of round 7. The problem with that is I like this is 20 spots later approximately than I rank Yelich, but it's about 40 spots earlier than his ADP. So his ADP needs to improve, but it's hard for me to say it's a great value or anything like that when he does go as late as he does. But I didn't want to take the risk of missing out on him, clearly, especially with stolen bases being what I considered a big need at that point in the draft. So anyway, I'll go with Walker or Naylor. I'll call it a tie between the two of them because they're so close in my rankings. And after them, you're kind of having to thread the needle at first base because you got Vinny Pasquantino, Spencer Steer, who may go as an outfielder, Tristan Casas. Kind of buzzy picks, Casas and Pasquantino, that you may end up feeling like you're reaching for. If you don't take one of them, though, things drop off pretty quickly after that. So getting the stability of Walker or Naylor here, I think, is a nice move.
I'll actually point out a pick from Chris. He took Edwin Diaz 75th overall, and I have Diaz in a similar tier as Clase and Devin Williams and Josh Hader. There's no doubt in my mind. Clase should be the RP1. He should go ahead of Edwin Diaz. Should he go 3 rounds ahead of Edwin Diaz? And as a result of getting Diaz here in round 7 versus Clase in round 4, I did think that was some pretty good value there on Chris's part. What about the worst pick of round 7, Scott? Who you got?
The worst pick of round 7 is Christian Yelich.
Wait, the best and the worst?
He's the best and the worst. Because I did the thing, I just scolded the guy who drafted Wyatt Langford about I took him earlier than his ADP. I just don't trust. I don't know. The drafts we've done, I haven't seen Yelich go that late. Maybe because I keep drafting him. I don't know. But I don't think
you probably wouldn't have got him because Chris said yesterday that he likes Yelich as well. So
yeah,
he would have had 2 other opportunities to draft Yelich. So you probably wouldn't have gotten him. But
there you go. See, know who you're drafting it with. and adjust accordingly.
In the next mock draft we do, you are not allowed to take Christian Yelich, just so we see how far it takes someone else to take.
Don't like that. Don't like it at all. All right, so to give you a different name, I'm going to say Mason Miller, who the fact he's going in the same round as Edwin Diaz, I don't think they belong together. But I've gone off on this a few times throughout the offseason. Just Miller's great. He's closing for the Athletics, and he didn't get to 30 saves last year, even though he stayed more or less healthy all year. And I think it's far from a given that he'll get to 30 saves this year.
Mm-hmm. I am going to highlight two players that I just don't really know what to expect, and that's Matt McClain, 78th, and Royce Lewis, 81st. Now, both just a couple of years ago. I mean, McClain, we saw have the big 2023. He missed all of last year with injury. We spoke about him extensively on yesterday's podcast. I think he should be more like a outside the top 100 pick. So for him to go inside the top 80, I think is too high for my liking. And then Royce Lewis, first half of last season, he looked awesome once again. Of course, he did miss a huge chunk of time, but when he played in the first half, he was great. Had another injury. Once he returned from that in the second half, he was awful. So we're just kind of left wondering, all right, who is the real Royce Lewis, and can he stay healthy? So you have two major questions, and you're using a top 100 pick on Lewis as well, where I believe his ADP is closer to like 110, 115. So just two names that I thought went a little bit too early in Matt McClain and Royce Lewis. Scott, put your FBT producer hat on, because I'm going to leave what we do up to you. Do you want to just kind of wrap up by recapping our teams, or do you want to try to get to a couple more rounds? We've got like 10 minutes left, so up to you.
Since we teased it, we should probably recap our teams.
Okay, so yeah, we got through the top 7 rounds here, and again, the results will be on the site. They'll come out in a newsletter from Chris on Friday, so obviously be on the lookout for those if you do want to see the rest of the picks in this draft. So let's quickly recap our teams, and we will start with Scott, who is drafting first overall once again. And I'll just kind of read things off in order, and we will start with the hitters. And in the infield, Scott, you had Joey Bart and Gabriel Moreno, followed by Michael Toglia.
Not off to a good start.
Ketel Marte, Rafael Devers, Willie Adames, Dansby Swanson as your middle infielder, Eugenio Suarez as your corner. All right, so you pick things up there. That looks pretty good. Your outfield, you have Brandon Nimmo, Jerkson Profar, Lane Thomas, James Wood, and Christian Yelich. And, of course, Ohtani as your utility hitter, who was the first overall pick. And just a reminder, when you're reading off these teams and you look at your team after drafting Ohtani, it always kind of feels like something's missing. But you have to remind yourself that you have maybe the best player. He's just in your utility spot.
Right. You kind of, your eyes are used to skipping over that utility spot, but your best player is there when you draft Ohtani. And that's certainly the case for my team. I think it's fine, the offense. I think it's well balanced across the categories.
I think it might be a little light on speed. That was the only thing that I came away with. I could be wrong, but everything else seems pretty balanced. And I know you waited on catcher to get those two guys in the last 2 rounds.
Not quite
bad.
The last 2 rounds, but late.
It was close to it. I think it was like the last 5 rounds or something like that.
Yeah, I find in the 2 catcher leagues, catchers, the quality ones can see their cost pushed up in a way that makes them prohibitive from my standpoint. So unless I get one at a great value, or William Contreras, I might be willing to pay top dollar for. Just didn't work out in this draft. But otherwise, I'm probably going to go the bargain route. You don't want to wait too long, though. You don't want to have Travis d'Arnaud, who's not even a starter, presumably, in one of your catcher spots if you can avoid that. So, yeah, I feel fine with the budget catchers. Michael Toglia at first base, that's the weak point, and was kind of the inspiration for me picking Christian Walker and Josh Naylor as the best picks of round 7, is because I didn't take care of first base then, and it kind of felt like it was out of my hands at that point. Like I said, there are others available, but me picking at the end, first overall, I couldn't be sure that I could secure one of the last handful of quality ones, so I had to settle for Toglia instead, who could be a big source of power, but he could slump his way out of the job completely. So definitely a risky move there. But otherwise, I think the whole lineup is good. Once you get past those first three, Ketel Marte at second, Devers third, Willie Adams at short, Dansby Swanson, a great middle infielder. Eugenio Suarez kind of in that Tolia mold where he could provide me 30-plus homers or be out of a job at some point, maybe replaced by Jordan Lawler, who knows. And then for not taking an outfielder until round 5, I think is when I took James Wood. I think my outfield turned out fine. I think Nimmo's a great value pick. Lane Thomas helps address my speed issue. Yelich helps address my speed issue. I think it's a solid rotisserie lineup.
All right. I did want to point out, hearing you talk about Tolia and just kind of some first base strategy, I really have noticed I want to get one of my top 10 names, which ends with Vinny Pasquantino and Cody Bellinger. In a deeper league, maybe you could stretch that to a Tristan Casas or Spencer Steer. I don't love Steer, but he'll probably be okay from in a Roto lineup as your starting first baseman. But yeah, I need to get one of those top 12 just because I don't want Tolia as my starting first baseman. I'm sure you didn't want that either, Scott, but it's just the way that the draft played out. But yeah, that's just another thing that's kind of standing out early on is I do want to get one of my top 10 first basemen if I could pull that off. Let's take a look at your pitching staff, and you wound up with Jose Barrios, Dylan Cease, Aroldis Chapman, Jack Flaherty, Max Fried, Bryce Miller, Aaron Nola, Jordan Romano, and Robert Suarez. So you got the 3 closers, Suarez, Romano, and Chapman, we think, going to close games for the Red Sox. And, look, for waiting until round 4 to take your first starting pitcher and then not taking another one, I think, until round, 6 or 7? It might have even been later than that, 8 or 9. This is a good staff. I mean, Cease, Fried, Nola, Miller, and Flaherty. I mean, that's a great top 5. So I think it's good.
So my number 2 pitcher was Aaron Nola, who I took at the end of round 8, the 96th overall pick. And then I took Max Fried with him back to back. So those were my 8th and 9th picks. And I don't think you can count on that every draft, but that speaks to the amount of quality options in that range, that 15 to 50 range, the good glob, which I guess I'm going to call it. There's just so many similarly capable options there that people are going to start picking and choosing their favorites. And I'm happy to just settle for whatever comes to me. In this case, Nola and Fried. And later on, I mean, if we'd gotten to round 10, the 120th pick in the draft, Bryce Miller, that felt like a total luxury pick for me because his ADP he's the 76th player off the board on average, and I got him at 120.
Yep.
At the very least, he should help with my whip, which was my most concerning category, I thought, with Cease being my ace. So yeah, I should have strikeouts covered, ERA, whip, Jack Flaherty. That felt like a luxury also as my number 5 starter. And then Jose Barrios was my second to last pick. And it's a little surprising that nobody seems to like, he just is a total afterthought in drafts now, even though he's been very consistent from year to year, mid to high 3s ERA, but a fine whip, always a lot of innings, which makes for a nice strikeout total, usually a good win total too. I think he's getting him as just kind of a throw in on this pitching staff. I think rounds it out nicely because I'm probably not taking him out of my lineup all year. I went a little light on saves, Robert Suarez being my number 1 reliever, but I never spend big on saves. Jordan Romano, number 2. Okay, maybe there's some health concerns there. And then I got Aroldis Chapman as a third one because I'll always take a third one, for somebody who doesn't want to invest in the big closers. Of course, at this point, it's hard to say with much certainty that Chapman is closing for the Red Sox, but given their current construction, he would be the leading contender. And he was my final pick, so not a big investment there.
All right. Again, that was Scott's team from the first overall pick. Let's take a look at mine. I was drafting 2nd overall, so right behind Scott in this draft. And my infield was Will Smith and Tyler Stevenson, followed by Vinny Pasquantino, Vinny P.
Baby.
Yeah, there you go. Jordan Westberg, Austin Riley, Bobby Witt. My middle was Andres Jimenez. My corner was Matt Shaw, the prospect from the Cubs. And then my outfield was Michael Harris, Brian Reynolds, Tyler O'Neill, Parker Meadows, and Alec Burleson. And then my utility bat was Marcell Ozuna, as we mentioned. So I don't know. I think it's okay. I think it's balanced. There's not a lot of big names involved here. I mean, obviously I've got Bobby Witt and Austin Riley, but not don't really have a lot of those typical big names from years past. I think it's probably okay. What do you think, Scott?
You said you thought my team might be light on steals. I think your team's light on steals. So there you go, right back at you.
Yeah, it might be. I thought about it mid-draft. Like Bobby Witt's going to give you 30 plus. I think Jimenez is probably going to give 25-ish. Matt Shaw, we don't really know, but based on the skill set, like maybe he's 15 to 20, something like that. Harris, probably 20 plus. Meadows, 15 plus. Reynolds will give you 10. So yeah,
well, you're hoping for more from Meadows. You're hoping for sort of like what I got with the Lane Thomas pick.
Yeah, it might be light. I thought about it mid draft. I was like, oh, maybe I waited too long after taking Bobby Witt. So,
but otherwise, I think it's pretty balanced. And yeah, I mean, not any huge holes. Burleson might not be a full-timer, so you may need to upgrade there with your fifth outfield spot. Shaw could be huge, but as we've seen from high-end prospects breaking into the majors the last few years, easier said than done, and you can't presume he's going to click completely.
I didn't even really want him, but I think I got him close to pick 250, something like
that.
Yeah,
you got him later than I rank him. I just didn't have a spot for him.
Yeah.
Or else I would have probably taken him before you did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I can't. You took the pitcher in round 2. You took Paul Skeens.
Right.
And I didn't. And I don't know that my offense is. I mean, I think I'd rather have my offense than yours, but it's not a slam dunk.
Yeah. I think one thing that we've learned this offseason, and we had a discussion closer to right after when the season ended. I like Burleson's skill set. I know he struggles against lefties, but the ability to make contact, hit for modest power, the package kind of reminds me of Josh Naylor, like before he kind of broke out. So I don't know that the power will ever get to where Naylor was last year, but I just like the overall kind of talent base there with Alec Burleson. So hoping he can build off of that here in 2025. Taking a look at the pitching staff, I did take Paul Skeens in round 2. I followed that up with Shota Imanaga as my SP2, and then Joe Ryan, Carlos Rodon, Luis Gil, and Brandon Pfaadt. And then my relievers, I got Andres Munoz, David Bednar, and I got Kenley Jansen pretty late, who remains a free agent, but I assume wherever he signs, it will be as a closer, at least to start the season, and then hopefully he can hold on to that job. Scott, for taking a starter in round 2, I kind of like the way that your pitching staff turned out as a whole compared to mine. Like, I think my top 3 is really good. I like Skeens, Imanaga, Joe Ryan. All will have great whips, and strikeouts should be good. But then some questions. Rodon, where the ratio's at? Can he stay healthy? Luis Gil was bad in the second half. So which version of him are we going to get? Brandon Pfaadt, another one who ended really poorly, but he looked pretty good in the first half. So I don't know. There are some questions here with the pitching staff.
Yeah. Mine ended up a lot deeper than yours, didn't it? And even the 1, 2, 3. I mean, Skeens, Imanaga, and Ryan, I'd be fine with that as a 1, 2, 3. But remember, my 1, 2, 3 was Cease, Nola, and Fried. Is your top 3 clearly better than my top 3? It has a better number 1, Skeens over Cease, but I think we'd both prefer Fried over Joe Ryan. So yeah, that's hard to that's interesting how it played out. So I think our offenses came out pretty similar, but you had to work harder to get that offense. I think when mine came about, I had the foundation in the early rounds, and then I could just keep attacking that good glob at pitcher, and was able to pile up some values that maybe you had to forego because you had to make up lost ground at hitting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think typically I would want to have a better SP4 than Carlos Rodon if I could. I think I actually wanted to take Bryce Miller right when you took him, and it's my own fault because I think, obviously you picked after me, so I could have had Bryce Miller. You had double tapped pitcher the previous go. So I assumed you weren't going to take Bryce Miller. And I was like, oh, I could get him on the next turn. But then you actually did take him as a luxury, like you mentioned. But yeah, if it was Skeens, Imanaga, Joe Ryan, Bryce Miller instead of Rodon, I think I would like this a good amount more. Not like Rodon could be fine, but I just have
it's just seems more volatile. Not that Bryce Miller is a sure thing,
right?
But Rodon, I don't think anybody would be surprised if he had an ERA over 4 based on the way last season played out. Last 2 seasons, frankly.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's going to do it. That's our 12-team Roto mock draft. Let us know in the comments if you watch us on YouTube who had the better team between Scott and I. We read off all of our teams and we told you, what we were thinking, some of our strategies there. But let us know who you thought had a better team, and we are going to wrap there. For Scott, I am Frank. Thanks as always for tuning in to Fantasy Baseball today. Please make sure to follow and leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify, and we will be back again next week. Bye-bye.